Today's lecture, entitled Conscience and the Revolutionary Spirit, The Case of Dostoevsky's Demons by Scott Yenor. And we are very happy to be hosting here today. Before we get started, I'd ask everyone to please silence your cell phones and other electronic devices. This event is part of the university's Cultural Life program. The program provides opportunities for students to participate in a variety of enriching and challenging cultural experiences. Through these events, students encounter a spectrum of issues and ideas and artistic expressions from various disciplines and cultures. It is expected that all participants display respect for presenters or performers, keep an open mind in the presence of new ideas and opinions, and conduct themselves with civility in the continuing discussion of these ideas. I'm Aaron Zubia. I teach political thought in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. This lecture is sponsored by the Tocqueville program, which is devoted to free, reasoned inquiry into life's most important questions, particularly those moral and philosophic questions at the heart of political life. If you are interested in an intellectual community that sees the truth about the enduring questions, the permanent questions about God, nature, and the human person, that is, if you'd like to think philosophically about morals and politics, then the Tocqueville program is for you. If you would like to learn more about the Tocqueville program, then I invite you to join the Political Thought Club, which meets every Friday afternoon. It's a fun group to be around, and we would love for you to join us for great conversations about great books and great ideas. Now, the work of the Tocqueville program is made possible by the generous gifts of individuals and philanthropic organizations who, along with those of us in the Tocqueville program, believe that genuine liberal education encourages students to become more thoughtful citizens and more dignified human beings. I want to thank our sponsors, Jenny and Sandy McNeil, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the AWC Family Foundation, the family of Jane Gage Hipp, the Strada Education Network, Mary and Bill Howes, Linda Gilkison, and many others, including former students who support the Tocqueville program. Today's lecture is part of the Ernest J. Walters Lecture Series in Political Thought. The Walters Lecture Series was established in 2001 to honor the life and legacy of Professor J. Walters. Professor Walters dedicated his professional career to Furman University, teaching in the Department of Political Science for 27 years. After his death in 1997, members of the Political Science Department decided that there could be no better way to honor his contribution than to continue his legacy with yearly visits by distinguished lecturers in the area of political thought. This annual memorial lectureship has been established by the students Professor Walters inspired and the friends and family he cherished. The theme of the Tocqueville program's course and lecture series is the revolutionary spirit and the human future. Populism, the pandemic, resurgent socialism have recently brought Americans to ask revolutionary questions, to reconsider the nation's founding narrative and its very identity, past and future. In this series, we will investigate the origins and the consequences of the revolutionary spirit. We will promote reflection on the history, psychology, and metaphysics of revolution, and we will ask, amid the stark moral, cultural, and political divisions we see in our society, where do we go from here? To help us think through some of these questions in a manner that is inspired by some of the great ideas derived from great literature, we have with us today Scott Yenor, Professor of Political Science at Boise State University. He is also a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, the Center for the American Way of Life there, and he was a visiting fellow in the Simon Center at the Heritage Foundation. Dr. Yenor has authored articles on David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment, presidential power, and literature and politics, in addition to other topics. He's the author of several books, including The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies, Family Politics, the Idea of Marriage in Modern Political Thought, and David Hume's Humanity, the Philosophy of Common Life and Its Limits. Dr. Yenor earned a Ph.D. from Loyola University, Chicago, and a B.A. from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, and I encourage you to subscribe to Dr. Yenor's YouTube channel, which includes many excellent lectures on literature and politics. Now please join me in giving a warm, firm and welcome to Dr. Scott Yenor.
Well, thank you guys for coming out today. It's great to be here, first of all, for the Tocqueville lecture. Can I turn this off? All right. I'll stand over here. If there's backlash, let me know. The Tocqueville Forum is something that's really kind of important to me. I've been friends with the people who've run it, and I'm glad to meet Aaron here this time. And Tocqueville is actually a very interesting person to think through the question of revolutionary spirit with. Because Tocqueville himself in Democracy in America says that there will no longer be great revolutions in the modern world. That is, there's no interest in pursuing great revolutions, and there's no debate left at all. So yeah, Tocqueville is one of the great thinkers of modern political life. He wrote a great book, Democracy in America. In Democracy in America, he says, among other things, that there will no longer be great revolutions in the modern world. Now, it's interesting, right? I mean, he wrote that in 1836. There's been some pretty great revolutions in the modern world since 1836. And the most significant of those revolutions, I think we can all agree, was probably in Russia. Happened about 80 years after Tocqueville wrote about the end of revolutions. And it's interesting, however, that just like almost one generation after Tocqueville, we have Dostoevsky writing. And Dostoevsky, writing from within the Russian tradition, is actually kind of predicting the Russian Revolution. He's kind of drawing out its implications, what directions it might take. And while I don't want to go too far in this direction, he's kind of saying it's going to succeed, because the things that exist in Russia that might restrain the revolution don't seem themselves to be strong enough to restrain it. And that's kind of the backdrop of his whole project, of Dostoevsky's project. Dostoevsky wrote most of his great novels, after 1862, and his last novel, right before he died, was written in 1880, The Brothers Karamazov, for which he is quite famous. And in this time of Russia, the 1860s and following, was a time of unbelievable turmoil and revolution. Now, it seemed to be in the air, and a lot of it seems to be really good. The serfs of Russia, those who were tied through heredity to the land, were not emancipated in Russia until about the same time the slaves were emancipated in America. That is, about 1863. In Russia, the serfs were free. And they weren't totally free. They were just kind of free, still tied to land, but not the landowners. And this was thought by many to be the beginning of the overturning of the entire Russian order. Some thought that the freeing of the serfs was just kind of a modest change in a regime that already existed. We'd keep the czar, we'd keep the church, we'd make these small changes in how serfs were treated, and that would be the end of it. It was a contained idea. But others saw this as just the kickoff to something much greater. And what we have in Dostoevsky's great novel, The Demons, I'm not going to read the whole thing for you. We'll read some of it. What we have in Dostoevsky's Demons is an account of those who are inspired by the changes that are happening in Russian civil society into seeing an utter transformation of the entire social order. Now let me be clear about what this means. Like, it's not just the abolition of private property and the imposition of something akin to communal ownership of property. I mean, that's part of it. It's not just that. It's not just the abolition of the family and the introduction of kind of communal family relations. Like, that's not all of it, it's part of it. it's not just the abolition of the Russian church and the overthrow of the Tsar. Once again, that's not all of it, but it's part of what the revolutionaries of Demons imagine. It's also the abolition of the Russian language. It's a little harder. But if you're going to have a universal political order, if you're going to have a genuine revolution, the whole organization of a nation needs to be upset. And the revolutionaries really do imagine not only all those smaller reforms like abolishing private property, but also the larger reform of imposing a uniform alphabet on the world. This, I mean, Tocqueville, if Tocqueville imagined this, I never found it in Tocqueville, this is a total revolution. And this is the prospect that Dostoevsky depicts in The Demons, and that other revolutionaries imagine. Now, it's not only this, but there's another element to the revolutionary spirit in Russia, and that is treatment of the means. What means can you use in order to bring about this new political order that does all the things that I just mentioned? And there is a deep and abiding literature on this question, the chief author of which is a man named Sergei Nechayev, who wrote a catechism for the revolutionary that goes about discussing what should all be done in order to bring this new moral order into being. And his answer, well, it has a lot of planks to it, can be kind of very quickly summarized like this: do whatever it takes. There are no moral limits that need to be observed in order to bring about this new order. So we have these two elements. We have the means that will be used, which they call revolutionary terrorism, and then the goals to be achieved, which go beyond what Marx and other thinkers imagine, that is the utter transformation of the political community. Excuse me. This is the situation that Dostoevsky faces. This is the reality that Dostoevsky depicts in Demons, his most political novel, and he criticizes or has to deal with both parts of this revolutionary spirit, both the means, unlimited terroristic means, and the goal, which is, I don't know what to call it, we'll call it the imposition of universal communism. And in fact, this book is very much concerned to depict what a revolution will entail. Not the main character, but one of the main characters, whose name is Pyotr Stepanovich, is supposed to embody the perfect revolutionary. People who will murder, rape, burn down houses, frame people for crimes, all in order to bring about the revolution. But that is not the deepest level of Dostoevsky's concern for this revolutionary spirit. Dostoevsky is also, kind of uniquely among authors in the modern world, attempting to show why the revolution cannot happen and should not happen. He's interested to show what elements of human nature and political life would have to be overridden, erased, in order for a complete revolution of society to be realized. And the key, or one of the two key elements for Dostoevsky in limiting the goals of a revolutionary state is what, from here on out, I will call the conscience. Now, there's another element, and we'll call it human nature. We'll probably talk about both of these tonight, but these elements within our souls, within our psychologies, would have to be erased, lobotomized, in order for a totally revolutionary society, totally transformed society, to ultimately be realized. Okay, so I think the conscience ends up being a big deal for Dostoevsky, because it's one of the chief obstacles to total revolution. We could put this all in a different way, And for those who have read Dostoevsky, you'll hopefully have read Brothers Karamazov. But there's a famous line from Brothers Karamazov that almost everyone has heard of, and maybe some people live their lives according to this line, which is, if there is no God, then everything is permitted. Now that is the revolutionary spirit. Both sides of the revolutionary spirit, both the means and the goal, summarize nicely in one little epigram. If there is no God, everything is permitted. You can do what you need to do in order to bring about what you want to bring about. And the whole book, Brothers K, is an attempt to show the implications of this particular idea that is brought forward by one character at one particular time. And I would summarize the way that Dostoevsky responds to that challenge by something like this. Everything is not permitted, therefore there is a God. And his attempt in that great book that's so rich and so full of insight into the way we live is to show that everything is not permitted. And how that must be connected to something above us or something permanent. So, like, the answer to if there is no God, everything is permitted, is since everything is not permitted, there at least might be a God. And the obstacle that that Dostoevsky, I'm sorry, I wanted to talk about Tolstoy, but I think time won't permit. The obstacle that Dostoevsky puts in the way to show that everything is not permitted is the conscience. People murder, and then they feel bad about it. That feeling bad is an indication that not everything is permitted. Where does that spark of natural law or right and wrong written on man's heart come from? Well, it doesn't come from nowhere. That's his primary conviction. And so there's a limit to what human beings can do, and there's a limit to the ways in which you can transform society. Conscience sets the limit. Now, Dostoevsky portrays this idea of conscience really throughout his whole corpus. Now, I shouldn't say like that, throughout his like post-1860 corpus, because the revolution kind of started in 1860, and he changed the way, what he was writing about. He himself was a revolutionary before 1860. He did some time in Siberia. He learned his lesson, I guess, and turned to something else. He turned to novel writing and gambling, which isn't as lucrative. I don't know which one is more lucrative. As a writer myself, I'll say gambling probably works better than writing, but I'm not encouraging anyone to do that. Not yet, at least. I haven't seen your writing. So the conscience is a theme really throughout his works. And I want to talk about two ways in which this comes about, maybe to turn people to these particular books, and then we'll get directly into demons. Right, the most famous book that depicts the human conscience in it, written by Dostoevsky, is a book called Crime and Punishment. Right, it's famous for, the tale of Raskolnikov, who's the main character. And what Raskolnikov does is murder a pawnbroker and her lame sister. He does it not to steal money from her, though he does kind of not in a very charitable way, not in a very systematic way, but just haphazardly steal from her. But he does it to prove to himself that he could kill another person. And right there in the beginning of the book, Raskolnikov puts an axe to a pawnbroker and the sister. And then he goes home, He goes a little crazy. He tries to deal with being crazy. And the book isn't as long as this, but it's like only 50 pages less probably. And most of the book is on him trying to deal with the fact that he has murdered the woman. He can't live with himself. He thought he could have lived with himself, but he can't. Eventually, he confesses his crime to the police. He's sent to Siberia, and there he eventually feels the joy of a genuine confession, a genuine recognition that he has violated conscience and right, and forgiveness. He does his time, and he is done with the crime. But the whole book is a depiction of what happens when you do something that you know is wrong. And it's a little flattering to say that there's a limit to what human beings can do. The story is obviously much more complex than this. The book can be, and maybe should be, partly read as that kind of morality tale to reinforce the idea of conscience. But it is at least that. It's at least that. Now, it's not only that, though, and I want to just talk about one more element of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because this man who committed the murder, Raskolnikov, was a student. And when he was a student, he entertained many interesting ideas. Among those ideas was the view that most of the people in the world must adhere to the law and to common morality. But there are a few, a favored few, who are so powerful, who are blessed with such vision, that they can invent new moralities. People like Moses and Solon, and the most important one for Raskolnikov, Napoleon. Think of what a bastard Napoleon was. I mean, he went to Egypt, he took an army, he fought the Egyptians, he lost, and then he abandoned 1.5 million men or whatever. I mean, I'm making these numbers up, but I'm a theorist, so you can't expect me to know that. So let's say he abandoned 200,000 men in France. Took his boat back to France. They all died. Didn't you betray your men, Napoleon? His answer: I'm more important than 200,000 men. Now, he has his own morality. He is not subject. It would be bad for all of us to do that, because we are ordinary people. But Napoleon is an extraordinary person. And different rules of morality apply to him. And Raskolnikov writes an article about what he calls the Napoleonic man. The man who is not subject to the normal limits of morality. And then, we learn this later in the novel, that he had written that article, then he put it to the test by murdering an innocent, and then another innocent. And he found out, I guess I'm not a Napoleonic man, that he is subject to the normal rules of morality. Now, the book is written, Crime and Punishment, great book. The book is written in such a way that you cannot tell what the upshot of the novel is. Either there are Napoleonic men, and Raskolnikov is not one of them, or there aren't Napoleonic men. And he leaves that kind of open, try to figure it out. And then he explores that issue in his next two great books. One of them is Demons, and the other one is Brothers Karamazov. Now, Brothers K, even thicker than this. Brothers K, great book, very famous, often people's favorite Dostoevsky book, certainly my favorite Dostoevsky book. But there is a character in that book whose name is Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov murders, frames for murder, gets someone else put on death row, and loves it. He has the time of his life. And he is really depicted as a human being without conscience, there's nothing internal to Smerdyakov that might deter him from doing the most evil things. Now, he does it out of spite and envy, but here in Demons, we have another Napoleonic man who embraces the idea that the normal rules of morality don't apply to him and puts it in the service of total transformation, that is, of the revolutionary project. He is the terrorist that will abide by the catechism of the terrorist. He will kill without remorse. He will steal, he will lie, he will change his character. He will play whatever role is necessary for that total revolution to come about. And his name, as we've mentioned before, is Stepan. It's not Stepan Drakunovich, that's his father. Is Pyotr Stepanovich. See, like the Russian names are all these crazy. So I'm going to call him Peter from now on. Cheapers. And I'm going to call him Peter from now on. And he's the man who casts the question that Dostoevsky had left dangling in Crime and Punishment. Are there Napoleonic men, or are there people who think they are, but just are always proving too weak in order to do it? And I think that the answer in Demons is kind of clear. And that is that Pyotr Stepanovich is without conscience. He's without remorse. And in fact, he commits great crimes, and then members of his revolutionary sect, they give up state evidence. They turn themselves in. And he's just like, what a bunch of weaklings. They can't live with the fact that they are serving the cause of total revolution. And he goes on to the next town to burn it down. So I think Dostoevsky kind of gives us the answer that there can be people who, if they have a conscience, it is so seared, it is so overcome with layers of political commitments that they're willing to be hypocrites, they're willing to pretend one thing and do another thing, they're ready to assassinate people's character or to assassinate them themselves, and get away with it without any word about what has happened. So this is a tough fact about political life. There may not be much you can do about people like Pyotr Stepanovich. And I think the only way you can deal with them is not through argument, but ultimately through the use of the law and force behind it. It's not depicted in the book because he is successful in undertaking his revolution, but all the political figures kind of regret that they didn't take action earlier, or at least many of the political figures in the novel regret that they didn't take action earlier. So what do we have? What do we have? What does Demons do for us? Well, the experience of Pyotr Stepanovich, of this great and successful revolutionary, Dostoevsky, through this experience of Pyotr Stepanovich, Dostoevsky shows us all the things that are within our souls that make us want to participate in total transformation or revolution. He shows how consciences, your sense of right and wrong, can easily be manipulated and to be made, to be transformed themselves into the service of social transformation. Things that no decent person, when you were alone with yourself, would ever think of entertaining, can be entertained entirely with the right social environment, with the right pressures, with the right sense of honor. And you could be made to do things that, like when you're listening to the better angels of your nature, you wouldn't ever think of doing. And the book goes through and depicts several things about this, and it gives us an insight into Pyotr Stepanovich's methods that I think is kind of handy to think about as you think about total transformation. He says at one point Peter Stepanovich says to another main character at one point that the most important weapon in the hands of the revolutionary is the ability to make people ashamed of their own opinions. That is, to make people submit to opinions from others without question, and to make such people, I should say, subservient to a larger narrative or cause. So that stepping outside of the shell of the revolutionary cell would make you feel like you've lost your entire identity. Once you have carved together a revolutionary group where everyone is ashamed of their own opinion, everyone is at your mercy. So for instance, I don't think many decent people would find people who sell Bibles and put obscene pictures in the Bible and then allow the people to keep selling the Bibles. And as they're selling the Bibles, the cops come in and they arrest the Bible hawkers for peddling obscenity. Well, Peter Stepanovich gets his people to do that. How? Those are the bad guys. I don't know if we should do that to that nice little Bible sales lady. What gives you the right to have your own opinion? And he gets people to serve his cause. And he gets people to do an amazing number of degenerate and obviously wrong things over the course of the novel. And he gets them to do it because he has carved together a sphere of thought that they are not allowed to step outside of. And all of them are around the idea that destroying anything attached to the old order justifies the means. So sacrileges, murders, all of them in the service of revolutionary terror, all of them in the service of tearing down the old order, all of them in the service of building this promised new order which never quite comes about. Now, other people can be dealt with in different ways. And one of the great themes of the novel is that it's easy for revolutionaries to manipulate people in positions of political responsibility. Peter Stepanovich does this all the time. And he does this by saying, we basically agree on what the goals are, but we have differences about the means. And once people have entertained that, it's difficult for them to put brakes on revolution. And in this particular book, those who just wanted to emancipate the serfs and to bring about due process and to bring more voting rights have very little will to stop the revolutionaries from taking the reforms further and further. Right out of the handbook of Sergei Nechayev, you deal with people who are in positions of political responsibility by appealing to their love of order, their lack of desire to act, and the shared principles that you may or may not have with them. Then they can become putty in your hands. And the whole book really depends on Peter manipulating the sense of right and wrong and the other psychological characteristics that the other characters have. They are all part of that 90% of humanity that can be manipulated by someone with a great idea who would like to bring that idea about in the town. And of course, from the beginning to the end of the book, the town is a peaceful place. It has pretty public-spirited leaders, but by the end of the novel, almost everyone is dead and the town is burned down. And you have to say that Peter has been very successful in bringing about the destruction of the old way by manipulating the consciences of the people who were available to him. And there's very few people who will resist him. There are characters today. We had class, and we talked about 5 classes of characters who were there to resist the revolution. And they all come across as like isolated or without a political institution from which they could extend power. They all shared certain characteristics, though. All of them were in one way or another attached to something of the old order. They were attached in some cases to the nation of Russia, in other cases to the monastery, in other cases to the very idea of beauty and the assault that would make on the equality that was attempted to be imposed through the total revolution. Like, there were elements who could resist, but none of them are strong enough, and the revolution continues. So where does that leave human beings? Well, it's a good question, and I think Dostoevsky has a certain kind of answer to that too, because there's one character who really unites all of the forces of personality that might be used to resist a total revolution. He's the most famous character in the book. His name is Stravogin, and Stravogin is a man of great anguish by the time we see him. But let's take a few steps back, because this is what I'm going to try to argue here. That is, for the demons, in the demons, there is no political salvation. That is, all of the elements of the old order that might stave off the total revolution and protect people from the intrusions of conscienceless terrorists are weak, too weak to resist. But there is at least the possibility of personal salvation. Now that is maybe small solace for a political community, but as human beings, it's kind of nice to have an out. So when the building's on fire, at least one person can escape, or at least people can escape one at a time, if not together. And that person that I want to use as an example, it's a failed example, but it's like almost successful, so it shows that there is this other possibility. Stravogin. Stravogin is bad, okay? Like, I could give you details. I'll give you a few details. He was raised to have a great love of the noble things in life, a great sense of awe at what could be beautiful and what could be high, and how those high things are distinguished from the low. He's a man who received a kind of liberal education that you get at the Tocqueville Forum, as a young man. But when he left for the university, he became, this is what I mean, he was bad. Not only killing people in duels, not only framing people for stealing things. I think there were 2 bodies in the duels, one person who got in real big trouble, sent to Siberia for something he framed him for. He not only bites off the ear of the governor, he not only he pulls the nose of an old nobleman. These are nasty things. Not only rapes a young girl and leading to her suicide, but he does all those things within the span of about a year. Not only that, but he joined the military, which is another strike in Dostoevsky's view, because that means you're going to be hanging out with people who do those kind of things and gamble and do other vicious things. So this man, Stravogin, has been bad. He's been bad. He comes home and he gets what Dostoevsky often does. The character gets brain fever. Now, I don't know that anyone, you guys know anyone who's gotten brain fever? It can be bad, I guess. And certainly when Dostoevsky's characters get brain fever, it ends up causing problems for them. They often die. Stravogin didn't die. I don't think it's because he was young. I think it's because of what I'll be talking about in a second. That is, and what is brain fever? It's the pangs of conscience. It's the recognition. It's a physical manifestation of a spiritual turmoil. And he gets brain fever. And he figures he has to do something different with his life. So he starts traveling the world. He sees some of the great paintings. The paintings remind him of the sense of the noble and the sense of awe that he had as a young man. He falls in with a sect of people, he has a lot of girlfriends in Switzerland. like one after the other or all at the same time, and just comes to realize that like it's not right for me to do all that. And he comes home. And this is the Stravogian we get in this book. He's a man who is filled with anguish at all the wrong he has done, at the ways he has gotten away with it, at the ways he has offended common morality. And he's filled with regrets, so much so that he can't act in the world. The revolution is afoot. He knows it's afoot. The revolution is aimed at killing some of his best friends. He cannot raise his hand to protect them. He warns them, but he doesn't raise his hand to protect them. Why is that? Because the ability to act presumes confidence in your character and the right and wrong that it is based on. Stravogian is a man of anguish and guilt, not a man of action. He acquiesces, almost funds the murder of his wife. Doesn't almost fund it, he funds it. He just doesn't hand it to the assassin directly. He puts it on the ground. Do what you want with it. So it's kind of, I'd feel bad about that. And I think a jury would convict me, and probably should convict me. And so, so he is unable to act, but the book ends, or at least I shouldn't say it ends, we see more of Stravogian after this, but the full development of his character is seen in a chapter that was withdrawn when he goes and tries to confess what he has done to a local monk, Father Tikhon. And the monk listens, and he's appalled, but he's also charitable and says that there's always remorse. You have remorse. Now you need to ask for forgiveness. And he can ask forgiveness, but he can't figure out to whom that forgiveness, the question for forgiveness should be addressed. And that's how his character ends. So what I think you can see in Dostoevsky's other novels, real possibilities for personal salvation, whose ground is prepared in Demons by this character Stravogian. Political salvation for Russia may be beyond the ability of Russia to attain. It's possible, it's going to require some sort of forceful state action informed by the confidence that people have in a country and in a church that is aligned to it. But the portrait of that he depicts in Demons suggests that that's too much to think could happen in Russia, which means that Russia will be subject to the revolutionary violence that he depicts. But personal salvation is definitely on the table and is one of the great themes of Brothers K, and could be, and in a way is, one of the themes of Demons, because there are characters who undergo kinds of conversions after they are disappointed by the possibilities of revolutionary violence. So I don't think that the conscience is simply a cope for Dostoevsky. It can be a cope. You can hope that there's going to be a limit to what revolutionaries will do because they have consciences. It's not that simple. People's consciences are always shaped by the regime that they live in and by the prevailing understandings of justice that inform our education and our laws. Our consciences are always shaped. In the modern condition, our consciences are shaped, if Dostoevsky is right, in light of the idea that if God is dead, everything is permitted, and God is dead. So everything is permitted. That idea, widely believed, will shape the consciences of many people. And when that does shape the consciences of many people, Dostoevsky has kind of shown you where that will lead. It is not simple-minded adherence to conscience that you get from Dostoevsky. He wants to say that there's a spark of divine right in all human beings that can be put under a bushel, can be misshaped by a cave, can be bent in directions of other sacred opinions, and that can ultimately be uncivil. But it's a permanent part of our condition that any revolutionary will always have to deal with. So I think there are resources within human nature always to resist revolution, personal resources, and political, with political implications, but the prevailing ideas of what is good, advantageous, and just will always prove more powerful in nature. Thank you.
Time for question and answer. We have someone with a microphone who will be walking around. So if you have questions regarding the lecture, please do raise your hand and we'll get that microphone over to you.
Testing. No? Okay.
You want to use my movable mic?
We got that.
Hello. Good evening, Mr. Yenor, and thank you for your speech. So one thing you talked about was, with kind of the revolutionary spirit, is its attacks on dissenting thought and dissenting ideas. And I would presume that this is something you see in our current society?
Is that the whole of your question?
No, it's just an initial part.
Just go ahead.
Okay, well, I would presume this is something you likely see in our current society. And then I would also presume you likely would think this is a negative thing, which I would agree. But I also think that, opinions need to be defended, and, some can be more prejudicial than they might be reasonable. And so I wanted to ask you about some comments you made in a speech at the National Conservative Conference a few years ago.
Let's reserve the questions for the topic of that.
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think I know where it's going. So, yeah, every political community has a kind of has a set of opinions that you can't walk outside of, right? And Plato calls that a kind of cave. That he likens the political community to a kind of cave. That there's certain opinions that every political community has that you just can't escape. So, for instance, like in America, in say 1789, right, I'm for monarchy would be a very unpopular opinion. And saying that you're for monarchy would get you excluded from polite company. Does this make sense? Now, I think that's in the nature of political life. But that can't be gotten around. Every political community has sacred opinions. Or as Nietzsche says, I'll use Plato and Nietzsche, who don't seem always to be on the same team, as Nietzsche says, every political community has something about which it will not laugh. That means there's something sacred. And I think that's always true. So I want to distinguish that from the revolutionary activity that we're talking about. Because the way Peter Stepanovich gives an account of this and the way Sergei Nechayev handles it is that glue can also be used and narrowed to build a revolutionary cadre within a larger political community that has different ideas of what is sacred or different things about which it will not laugh. That is, it's a crucial element of building a revolution within a pre-existing society to use the methods of that society to build up a revolutionary core against that society. So yeah, I think that both of those, one would want to distinguish each of these elements. That is, there's a way of building a revolutionary cadre where everyone who falls outside of it and is part of the old order should be killed, canceled, protested, whatever you want to say. And then there's a set of opinions that no matter what, a political community is going to have gluing it together. So yeah, I would be careful about eliding both those things, but they're both realities, I think, of political life. The latter, the revolutionary kind of circle, is if Dostoevsky's right, and I think he is right on this, is a distinctly modern phenomenon. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Any other hands? All right, in the front here. Yep.
So I would just like to ask if we do have revolutionaries, and if you see them as a problem, would it not be more efficient to try to tackle the systemic issues that perhaps society reinforces or created to make these people revolutionaries in the first place, rather than just quelling them with more force? I guess I'm saying that revolutionaries are more of like a syndrome than just an anomalous like outburst of, amoral violence. And wouldn't you say that maybe a systemic transformation would be the best way to avoid that?
Yeah, oh, that's good. So how do you change without revolution? And yeah, I think those are like questions of detail. So let's use a couple of examples from human history to try to illustrate those points. Because there are, on the one hand, legitimate revolutions. That is, there are illegitimate political orders, and there are also orders that are called illegitimate because of ideological bents, right? And so we want to distinguish it. We want to be able to distinguish these particular things. So let's take the American Revolution. Now, this would get me like in trouble in 1789, but I'm kind of against the American Revolution. I don't think there's that much we can do about it now. But, so I'm for sticking with it, I guess. But like King George, I'm gonna pretend now I think this. So, King George was bad, and he was getting worse. And the colonists did everything they could to kind of mediate the problems. They offered compromises. They asked for kind of changes of the law. They asked for some representation. They sent over, they had correspondences among the colonists that they sent over to England and tried to work things out. And the king just kept getting worse and worse and suspending self-government. So the only way they could maintain self-government was throwing off the yoke of King George. Okay, I said it. I don't believe it, but I said it. And so that might be a legitimate revolution because the diagnosis was accurate. It captured what the king was doing, and therefore it did a great job. It did a great job. So the legitimacy of the revolution depends on the accuracy of the diagnosis. Now, when you look at, let's say, the Bolsheviks, or when you look at even the Russia of Dostoevsky's time, was the political community reforming? Yes. The direction was all in the same direction. The idea that the only way that we can solve society's problems is if we abolish languages, abolish property, abolish the family, kill the Tsar and his family, is the result of an ideological bent that has never been found in the world. Dostoevsky's diagnosis is of that particular ideological bent. So, answering systematic problems with systematic answers depends on the actual accuracy of those systematic answers and the actual accuracy of the diagnosis. So I think it's a question of detail, and my guess is that there's going to be very few opportunities to justify the abolition of all languages and the unification of mankind under one. Imagine there's no countries. It's easy if you try. But bringing it about is going to be like one hell of a job. Thank you.
Hand in the bag here next to the start.
Pass this on now.
Hello.
Hi there.
So the purpose of the Cultural Life program here is to open the minds of students to a variety of beliefs. To simply put, you are here to diversify the thoughts of our Furman community. To quote one of your talks at the conference, diversity is just the opposite of the strength that we need as a country. And to continue on, de-emphasize our college and universities because, as put, indoctrination camps, they act as indoctrination camps and the citadels of our gynocracy. So, to follow up with these quotes, I was wondering if you still hold these beliefs as you're able to come to our university and talk due to the promotion of education. Why take to heart what you have here to say if, according to your own beliefs, would suggest that even you should not be here today?
Yeah, I'm surprised I'm here, and thank you guys for coming. I wonder if there were even efforts to get me uninvited, but it's possible. And there might even been efforts to make me feel unwelcome. That might be evidence for my position. However, like I'd be happy to engage that question on a different level, and that is on the meaning of the word diversity. That is, I do think that that universities presuppose both a kind of unity and a kind of diversity. Right? Universities presuppose a unity of mission that is an agreement on what an educated human being would be. And I think there's a lot of different elements of what an educated human being could be, and those different elements are really like an expression of what diversity would be. So for instance, I'm sure Furman has this, but I'm not, but please don't hold it against me if I'm wrong, that there might be a college of sciences and a college of social sciences and maybe a college of humanities. Like under the old circumstances, those would be all thought of as important contributors to genuine diversity within the unity of what it means to be an educated person. My guess is that when those colleges were established, Furman had a pretty specific idea of what they wanted to accomplish within those colleges toward promoting a particular kind of educated human being, right? Now, my diagnosis, which you can take or leave, is that those distinctions between colleges are no longer as important because many universities now have an entirely different idea of what an educated human being is. I would call them kind of fanatics. But I'm not, I'm not going to die on that or fall down on that sword. I'll say people with a particular ideological bent. That almost all the disciplines have been, in humanities and social sciences at least, have been overridden by a particular set of views that preclude the old idea of what an educated person is. So I do think that universities have a very unified vision of what they would like to accomplish, both at administrative and departmental levels. And I don't think that vision is consistent with the traditional understanding of what a liberally educated person is. Thank you. Thanks. That was a great question.
Hey, Dr. Yenor. Hey, so one thing you mentioned in your lecture was the Napoleonic man and its role in the revolution. Would you say that a revolution that's more decentralized, like grassroots, so to speak, is possible, or must the revolution have some sort of Napoleonic man to center around and proponent towards radicalism?
That's too hard of a question. I'm not positive what the answer is. There is a kind of hive mind that all revolutions seem to presuppose, which is what Pyotr Stepanovich means by the people having shame at their own opinions. There's a kind of hive mind that is absolutely essential to the operation of a modern ideological revolution. And it often seems that that hive mind is not like traceable to one person, right? It's like most of the people who participate in that ideological transformation, you just feel like if they blew off the face of the earth tomorrow, they could be easily replaced by an exact replica of the same person with the same opinions, right? So they run corporate boards, then they go to the administrative state, maybe then they'll go and run a school district, and then maybe they'll go to, there's plenty of places, and they're kind of interchangeable parts. And that would lead you to think that it's decentralized. It's like the same mind, but it's spread out everywhere. And I think that's totally legitimate to think that. It's a characteristic of an oligarchy not to be able to identify any one person who is, stirring the boat or rocking the boat or creating the change. And so, I'm inclined to think that it can exist with an ideology and without the Napoleonic man. But then, when you look at history's examples, does the Russian Revolution work without Lenin? I mean, you guys have all studied this, right? You guys have history classes on history. Would the Russian Revolution have succeeded without Lenin? Probably not. Does the American Revolution, I don't want to compare Lenin, am I allowed to do this? All right, I'm going to stop myself. Does the Chinese Revolution succeed without Mao? Does the Cuban Revolution succeed without Fidel Castro? You guys study this stuff, right? I mean, it's hard to imagine that any of them could succeed without those great people. And then the question is, who knows what that means for America? Who knows what that means for America if there is such a thing afoot? Have we had the Napoleonic man already? That's something to think about. Maybe the Napoleonic man has already been here, and he's already stirred it up, and it's already led to a kind of revolution in the country. It's possible. Maybe he's yet to come. That's also possible. I mean, I don't know. Someday I hope to think about that question, but that's the way I would think about it right now.
Thank you.
One question. You mentioned Stavrogin was educated in ideals of abilities and beauty. You mentioned the goal of educating particular ideals. It seems like Stavrogin had this, and he loses it. Can you just say a little bit more about the environment that's necessary, or first of all, the value of a liberal education and its staying power, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, as a young man, Stavrogin was raised by a tutor in his home. Ends up being one of the great liberals and one of the only transformative characters in the book. His name is Stefan Drapinovich. I got that one right.
Yeah.
And he creates in him through books and really through speeches and through comradeship. It's a very one-on-one type of education. This sense of awe at what could be accomplished. And then he goes off to the universities. And there, I think, Dostoevsky never says this, but no one ever comes back better from the universities in his books. And he goes there and he learns that if God is dead, everything is permitted. And that's when he begins he loves bad, so that's when he frames people for crimes and commits many crimes himself. It is bad, and it's really actually hard to read that part of the book. That part of the book was censored in its time for its raciness, and you can see it must have been a decent society to censor such monstrous things. So yeah, the root of liberal education seems to be, and I think is, that there are permanent questions that draw people out. Like what is righteous? What is good or bad? How can you treat can you treat other people as means to your ends? What ways should a political community be organized? What are the limits of reform? Like those are like big questions, and like that's just leaving out other things. Like what's the rank of being in love? That's actually, I think, the theme of Dostoevsky's book. What comes first? The primordial experience of love, or the experience of actually just being a thing? And he thinks love comes first, and which I think is the only like real Christian answer to the question. So a liberal education puts those questions front and center, and then looks at the greatest minds as they investigate them. But it obviously can be corrupted, and it can be corrupted by like an ideology that says there is one way of answering these questions, and this ideology, and the best way to extinguish those questions is to say that they're irrelevant to our efforts for social reform. If it doesn't help social reform, it isn't a question. And that's turning a university and turning a student who goes to that university, like someone like Stavrogen, into like someone whose wings have been clipped and who is unable to think about the deep questions and is only able to think about what is necessary for political reform now. And so I think the intrusion and the primacy of politics and the theoretical view that goes with it is one of the great threats to liberal education.
All right, well, thank you everybody for attending. Let's thank Dr. Yenor.
Hey everyone, hey y'all, you guys have been very patient. Make sure you sign your names out on, there's a sign-up sheet out there so that you all get credit. And some of the folks that left earlier, but they're not here.